Rachel or Benjamin, as an infant, would say to me, "Guess how much I love you? I love you more than a clean, dry diaper." And I would say to them, "And I love you higher than the pile of diapers that I have changed for you." That is very high. As a 1-year-old, Rachel might say to me, "I love you further than I can fling strained peas." And I'd reply, "And I love you harder than I could scrub them off the wall." And Benjamin, as a 2-year-old, would say, "I love you louder than I can scream during my bath." And I would reply, "And I love you softer than I can sing a lullaby." Trying to express the depth of love that we have for someone can be challenging. And in this story, little nut brown hair tries to find the perfect way to express his love for big nut brown hair. And every time he thinks he's found the perfect way, his father demonstrates that his love not only encompasses little nut brown hair's love, but then goes beyond what his young mind could even imagine. And isn't this the way it is with our relationship with God? The psalm we read tries to find some way to express our awe and deep reverence for the world that God has made and for the creation that God has created around us. The psalm says, "O Lord, how sovereign is your name, how majestic is your name in all the earth." It's like we're saying, guess how much we love you, God. We love you as far as the stars in the heavens. We love you as high as the birds can fly. We love you as deep as the fish can swim in the ocean. Psalms like this and children's books like these fill us with good feelings, reminding us of what it feels like to have that kind of love for which there really are no words. But I have to admit that there are times in the parent-child relationship when things don't go so well. And on those days, as good as this book is, it's not always quite enough. I remember one day when Rachel was about 2, and she had had one of the most difficult days I could remember. It seemed like everything she wanted to do, I had to say no to, like standing up on the high chair and jumping up and down, or taking the remote controls and dismembering the buttons. And it seemed like everything that I wanted her to do, she just had to say no to, like having her mouth and hands wiped and taking her evening bath. Well, by the time we got to our bedtime ritual, which, just last week I'm blithely recounting to you in all of its loveliness, all I wanted to do was to toss her into bed, flip off the light, slam the door. And all I could manage to do was to say a prayer through gritted teeth and say the fastest lullaby on record. And exhausted from our fighting, she promptly fell asleep. I was not feeling very loving that night. And I know she was not too happy with me either. And I know that there will be many more unhappy nights like the time when she was 2. And that's going to play out in teenage ways in our household. So if that's what happens on a small scale between one parent and child, imagine what it's like when it's between a person and God, and when that's multiplied by millions and billions who are suffering from some kind of tragedy or misfortune and having intense feelings of anger towards God. This was brought to my attention several years ago when a mother in my previous congregation asked me for some advice when she wanted to talk to her child who was asking her about the school shootings that had been in the news and had killed so many young lives and devastated so many families. Why did God let this happen? The girl wanted to know. And indeed, many adults have that same question when something like this happens and these feelings of anger and frustration and grief come up. The happy psalms and the bedtime stories don't seem to offer much comfort. This mother also shared with me that her daughter had a similar reaction on September 11, 2001, when the terrorists flew planes into the World Trade Center. The youngster, who was in kindergarten at the time, said, "This must mean that God isn't perfect, because God made a mistake in letting this happen." Now, when a child comes to such a conclusion, I've seen adults react in usually one of two ways. One way is to respond with the standard cliches and pious platitudes that can leave us feeling hollow and frustrated. Well, God must have a plan, we just don't understand it yet. Or, yes, but now those people aren't in pain anymore. Or worse, this was God's way of punishing those people for what they did. I have heard all of these responses, some of them by pastors. Not helpful. Some of them, the first two, might have some truth to them, but they're not helpful for a child or for any of us. But the other way that sometimes people can react can leave a child just as frustrated, which is to say, "I don't know, honey, I just don't have an answer." Now that is an honest response, but it does nothing to reassure the child or to give hope of any kind. There is a third way, and it's a two-part response. First, it's important to ask the child what she or he is feeling or thinking, and let them simply articulate those opinions and those thoughts without judgment. It's okay for children to have doubts and ask questions. It's okay for them to think that maybe God makes mistakes or God is not perfect, because God can handle those thoughts. God handled it from Job. God handled it from the prophets. God can handle it from a child. Now, we might not be able to handle that. We might find that those thoughts are irreverent or offensive. But if people like Moses and Abraham and Thomas can have their doubts, certainly children can be afforded that same privilege. In fact, I've always encouraged Sunday school teachers and youth leaders to allow ample time for their students to talk about these topics, things that are happening in their lives that are on the news. When we were at the ELCA youth gathering, the final 15 that we would have each night, where we could talk about the things that we had seen and the joys and the sorrows and the things that frustrated us, that is where the day came together. And there was a depth of processing and feeling and emotion and a growing of faith that couldn't happen any other way. So for adults to simply give children that time and space to express themselves, for us to listen without judgment, to respond with compassion, and to embrace them, doubts and all, with unconditional love, models for them the kind of love that God has for us. Because when you allow a child, or an adult for that matter, to process through their questions at their own pace and in their own way, they will often find a way through the maze of doubts, and they will come to a place where they learn something. And they might even be able to teach us as well. For example, this same mother that I was talking about shared with me that later their family had mourned the loss of a family pet, a beloved dog that had grown up with the girls. Not long afterward, they got a new puppy, and the mother and daughter were taking the puppy for a walk, and the daughter said, "You know, Mom, I think maybe God doesn't make mistakes after all. People make mistakes, and sometimes bad things happen, but God makes sure that you get through it, and good things will happen again." Our psalm says, "Out of the mouths of babes and infants, you have founded a bulwark against your foes." There is incredible wisdom in the words of a child. So it's important not to shortchange a child's process. But the second part of the response is to also share your feelings and thoughts with the child and to communicate them in an age-appropriate way. If my child were asking questions like this, it would be important for me to communicate that while I don't have all the answers and I don't understand how this could happen, I will say this: I don't believe God caused this tragedy or simply let it happen, because that would mean that God is cruel. And I don't believe in a cruel God. That hurricane that you heard about is an act of nature. And sometimes we think acts of nature are good, and sometimes we think they're bad. The violence done by people is not right, and it's not fair, and God doesn't like it. God creates us to be good people, and sometimes people make very bad choices. But if you're wondering where God is in all of this, look at the billions of people all over the world who have donated money and time and relief to those affected by these tragedies. Look at how many people are reaching out. Look at our church who goes to help people and feed the hungry and help build houses and go to Detroit. Look at what God inspires people to do. It brings people together to make a difference, to help communities be safer. God works through us to bring hope and healing and love to those in need. And if my child would ask me, how did you come to this conclusion in your heart and your mind? I would tell them it's because of what I read in the Bible and from what the church teaches. And that teaches that God has experienced the same things that we have experienced. God understands and God cares. Just a few weeks ago, when we were at RB Winter Camp, we heard the words from the Gospel of John. The Word became flesh and lived among us. Jesus is the key for Christians to make sense of these tragedies that happen anywhere in the world or right in our own families. Our lessons today from Hebrews and Luke tell us that even though a great wave of hostility and selfishness and bitterness rose up against Jesus, God was right there when the wave hit. And I doubt whether I would have any idea how it felt for God to experience that. But God knows what it's like for me, and I am not alone in what I'm feeling. And in the crucifixion, when it seems like the story has come to an end, we as Christians believe that that's not the end of the story, that we don't close the book. We believe that the disaster or that violence or that disease or that suffering is not the end of the story, that there is another page to come. There's more to the story. There is the resurrection. And Jesus stands in the midst of us with his flesh and says, thus it is written, that the Messiah is to suffer and to rise from the dead on the third day, so that repentance and forgiveness may be proclaimed to all the nations. You are the witnesses of these things. And see, I am standing with you as the Father promised. There is reason to hold on to hope. Maybe with a little tweaking, a book like this does have something to offer when we're faced with suffering. I love you this much, says little nut brown hare, stretching out his arms as wide as they can go. And Jesus says, I love you this much, stretching out his arms on the cross as wide as they can go. In the book, the Father Bunny says, I love you right up to the moon and back. But Jesus says, I love you right up to the cross and